Good morning. Can I have your attention? I want to welcome you all. I'm Bill Rhodes, and I'm a member of the Bretton Woods Advisory Council, and we're very happy you could make it here on this very important day, particularly since we're already entered into the summer, so we're especially happy that you're here. And the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Lew, will be speaking to us shortly. And of course, you couldn't ask for a more important time for the Secretary to speak to this meeting with the question of Brexit and the roiling of the markets that we've seen over the last couple of days. If you could put your cell phones on silent, and if you have to take a call, you can always go outside. We're not going to have any breaks. We have the coffee and breakfast right there, and we'll have a question and answer period after each speaker. And now I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Randy Rodgers, who will be introducing Secretary Lew. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Bill. And I'd just like to share with the committee, too, good news in that Bill's been playing an increasingly integral role with our leadership team, and the committee's all the better for it. So we hope that continues in the future. We couldn't have foreshadowed probably a better program title based on recent events, and we're very fortunate to have Secretary Lew here to help us decipher it. Secretary Lew was confirmed by the United States Senate on February 27, 2013, to serve as the 76th Secretary of the Treasury. Previously, he served as White House Chief of Staff in the Obama administration and has held various positions in the Obama and Clinton administrations and with House Speaker Thomas P. O'Neill earlier in his career. All of you have been well aware of the committee's efforts for the last 5 years to help try and drive IMF quota reform through the U.S. Congress. And Secretary Lew is absolutely instrumental in helping push this long overdue quota reform through the Congress last year. So on behalf of the entire Bretton Woods Committee, I'd certainly like to express our sincere appreciation for your leadership, Mr. Secretary, in that regard. I'll leave it there, and with that, invite Secretary Lew to the podium for his opening remarks.
Good morning, and thank you, Randy, for that kind introduction and for your leadership within this great organization. It's a pleasure to join all of you again for this important and very timely discussion. I'd like to start with a few words about the United Kingdom's referendum on membership in the European Union. We respect the decision of the voters of the UK and will work closely with London, Brussels, and our international partners to ensure continued economic stability, security, and prosperity in Europe and globally. In recent weeks, I've been in regular contact with my counterparts and financial market participants in the UK, the EU, and around the world. And we will continue to consult closely in the days, the weeks, and the months ahead. The Bretton Woods institutions were born more than 70 years ago out of a sense of international interdependence, cooperation, and responsibility. They helped usher in a period of unprecedented economic gains, lifting people out of poverty and creating conditions for a more peaceful world. We must all build upon that shared responsibility by recognizing that we have the capacity and political will to boost growth and overcome the challenges facing the global economy. We must also continue to reform and improve the broader global economic system, including the Bretton Woods institutions, to confront today's challenges. And policymakers must redouble efforts to clearly explain the benefits that flow from these large global institutions, which can often seem removed from the day-to-day lives of citizens. As we move forward, it's important to stress that the UK, European, and global policymakers have the tools necessary to support not just financial stability, but also to promote economic growth. And it's incumbent upon major economies to use all tools available. That means fiscal, monetary, and structural tools to boost global demand and create the kind of inclusive economic growth that has been lacking worldwide. As we work with our partners around the world to advance this critical work, we're reminded again of the importance of U.S. leadership in the global economy. Sustaining that leadership and adapting it to the challenges of our time remains indispensable to the well-being of American workers and families, as well as to the ability of the United States to project its values and achieve its larger foreign policy objectives. And to that end, we have worked tirelessly to build and strengthen our position while using it to promote policies that foster economic growth and opportunity, both at home and around the world. When I spoke to this group last year, Trade Promotion Authority faced an uncertain fate in Congress. The Export-Import Bank lacked congressional authorization, and the path for approval of IMF quota reform remained unclear. Since then, we've made significant progress. Congress passed TPA last summer, and in the fall, we finalized negotiations on the historic 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership. In December, a bipartisan breakthrough led to the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank. And as a result of the concerted efforts of our team at Treasury and many of you in this room, Congress finally approved IMF quota reform. We could also add to this list other achievements, including the Iran nuclear deal reached last summer and the landmark climate agreement reached in December. These are meaningful accomplishments, but as I noted recently in a foreign affairs essay, the case for continued U.S. economic leadership faces a wide range of challenges. In order to confront those challenges and sustain our position in a rapidly changing world, we must take a long-term view of our economic influence and its value to our citizens and the world. History has shown that U.S. economic leadership is vital to the well-being of American workers and families and has been an essential tool for projecting our values and achieving broader foreign policy objectives. Those benefits are the central motivation behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will level the global playing field for U.S. workers and firms while getting other countries to meet a high bar on environmental, labor, and intellectual property standards. It would open global markets by connecting U.S. businesses with consumers in many of the world's fastest-growing economies. And that's why the President remains committed to securing congressional approval this year. We also continue to make progress on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Similar negotiations are underway in reaching a trade and services agreement that would deepen integration and influence the development of the global services architecture with countries representing roughly 70% of international services output. Going forward, we need to ensure that our global trading system continues to set high standards in terms of engagement and more robust protections. U.S. workers need to be able to compete on a level playing field in a world with high standards on labor, environmental, and ethical business practices. Beyond quota reform, we continue to work to modernize the IMF, allowing for more candid and forceful review of issues like exchange rates, current account balances, and shortfalls in global aggregate demand. And we need to ensure that the World Bank and the regional development banks have the resources and expertise they need to address today's complex challenges and promote the kind of sustained development that benefits all people in all communities around the world. In the international financial regulatory system, reforms have already resulted in more rigorous capital standards, greater transparency, and stronger tools for addressing struggling institutions. But we must continue to focus on implementation and potential emerging threats. Financial institutions in the US, UK, and Europe just last week demonstrated greater resilience because of the progress we've made. As we remain vigilant, we must also keep pace with advancements used by our adversaries. The U.S. and its partner countries have stepped up efforts to combat terrorist financing, corruption, money laundering, and other financial crimes as they pertain to ISIL and other threats. Finally, We must all commit to making even greater progress with emerging market economies to address priorities such as open investment, improved implementation of tax policies, and greater financial inclusion. We know that a system built on cooperation and high standards of economic governance works. Earlier this month, I returned from the 8th Strategic and Economic Dialogue in Beijing, where our discussions led to a number of important commitments by China. The United States and China are the two largest economies in the world and have been the primary engines of global economic growth in recent years, which is why it's so important to maintain close engagement with China as we continue to press them to reform their economy. China pledged to implement important domestic reforms to coincide with its transition to a consumption-led economy. And we challenge China's policies that disadvantage our firms and workers, including currency practices, trade barriers, and excess capacity in industrial sectors. China committed to undertake further steps to resolve its domestic excess steel capacity and outlined a package of structural reform policies that would enable its steel industry to be more responsive to market forces. While these signs are promising, we know that more remains to be done to further open China's markets and encourage greater foreign business investment, specifically with regard to removing discriminatory trade and investment barriers. Importantly, we also received commitments from China that new organizations like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank would conform to the high standards set by existing international financial institutions. For more than 70 years, the Bretton Woods institutions have served our global economic system by providing the foundation for greater international cooperation. This has contributed to both greater economic well-being and geopolitical stability. It's in that spirit that we press ahead to ensure that our modern economic architecture is positioned to confront the new challenges that we face in the years ahead. Thank you all for coming to these meetings and for what you bring to these discussions. And I look forward to taking Randy's questions and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Well, let's start with Brexit, the news of the weekend. I think it's fair to say that the only certainty at this stage is uncertainty, which implies plenty of market volatility to come. And many would characterize Brexit as a political black swan event, certainly for the markets. That's created a political crisis in the UK, an existential crisis for the EU, and certainly will have to be determined economic, financial, social, geopolitical, potentially trade and investment repercussions to come. So I wanted to ask as far as U.S. risks, both short-term and long-term. On the one hand, the U.S. financial system is in much better shape right now. We've got banks much more capitalized and far less levered than they were in 2008. The U.S. economy seems to have been resilient as well. Are you concerned at all about short-term risks to the financial system, and how do you potentially see Brexit affecting U.S. economic growth longer term?
First, Randy, thanks so much for having me today. And obviously, we have been looking at the potential outcome of the vote for some time, working closely with our counterparts in finance ministries and central banks in Europe and around the world. And I think unlike a natural disaster or a surprise, everyone knew the vote was happening on Thursday, and everyone knew that it was going to go one way or the other. I think that if you look at the preparations that were made, they reflected how much stronger our financial institutions are than they were in 2008, and how much better our system of communication and cooperation is than it was in 2008. On Friday, there was certainly a lot of volatility. It's a big change. It will have implications in terms of short, medium, and long-term developments, particularly in Europe and the UK.
But you didn't see markets operating in a disorderly way. Quite to the contrary, you saw them operate in an orderly way. The fact that there were moves in asset values is a reflection of how change is absorbed by markets. I think we have to assume that we're entering a period of change. And regardless of the timetable that the UK and the EU work out in terms of next steps, that period of change will take some time. When I think about the US economy, I think that it has been a source of strength in a relatively weak global economy, that our economy is 85% roughly a domestic economy, and the bulk of that is consumer driven. So we have resilience built into our economy, but we're not cut off from the world.
Sure.
Our economy has been growing notwithstanding headwinds from the global economy, and this is another headwind. So what I believe that we need to do in the United States is stay very focused on what can we do to keep the US economy growing, what can we do to address some of the anxieties about inclusive growth that are present in the United States and have been for some time, and what can we do to work with our colleagues around the world to use all the policy tools that they have to promote growth in an environment which is now influenced by the change of last week's vote. I think policymakers here and around the world continue to have tools. The challenge is for us to use those tools effectively and for the events that will unfold to unfold in an orderly way.
Very good. Well, let me shift a little bit more towards our program theme, the spirit of multilateralism, and wanted to have you give us a litmus test on the current levels of global interest and commitment to multilateralism, the current levels of U.S. interest and commitment to multilateralism. There's some who might string together this rejection of the EU for British citizens as a rejection of globalization in some degree, widely populist movements growing throughout the West. And you can even consider potentially emerging actors whose middle classes have actually benefited greatly over the last several decades, looking to try and gain their own influence by establishing institutions such as the AIIB and the BRICS Bank. Is there the underpinnings of a story there about multilateralism to be had?
I think as I wrote recently in a foreign affairs article, if you look at the history of U.S. views towards multilateral endeavors, it has always been an uphill battle. From Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations to the formation of the Bretton Woods organizations in the aftermath of World War II. I think what we've learned in the last 70 years is how important the commitment to multilateralism has been to promoting a stable, growing global economy that has lifted people out of poverty and has created opportunities for countries to work together in a peaceful way. If you look at the areas of the world where growth has created stability and imagine a different picture, a world that didn't have that, it's not a better world, it's not a safer world, it's not a world where American values have a better chance of prevailing. U.S. values are seen in all of these international financial institutions. We help build them, we play a very leading role in them, and when we promote things like fair trade, when we promote things like high standards on financial, labor, and environmental practices, that reflects American values. When we work with our colleagues around the world, other nations around the world, to try and do things like bring pressure to bear on a country like Iran or North Korea, our ability to do that is in part related to the centrality that the U.S. plays in the global economy, both by being the world's reserve currency and by being a moral leader in these institutions, which are not just financial institutions. I think the American people benefit greatly from that. Where I think we have fallen short, and I say all of us who believe in multilateralism, is translating the benefit of that into the day-to-day lives of people who are not thinking about the global economic stage. They're thinking about their job, their paycheck, and what the future means for them and their family. I believe that these commitments to multilateralism have made a more secure future. But we haven't succeeded in translating that. And part of the problem is that we have underlying divisions, which are not just since the financial crisis. It's been developing over decades, where the distribution of opportunity and economic benefit has grown increasingly disparate between people at the top, people in the middle, and people at the bottom. And I think that we need to focus on translating the economic benefit from better global growth to the day-to-day lives of working people. The answer isn't to shrink the pie. The answer is we've got to make sure that all have an access to the skills they need to compete, to the infrastructure they need to have a better future, and to have the rising tide truly lift all boats.
Makes sense. I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience, and that's on China. And you mentioned in your remarks you were recently there for the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. How do you view the progress being made in China's economic rebalance? And there's a lot of risks out there. What areas really concern you most about spillovers within China's financial system? Are you concerned about the overall levels of debt floating around in the system, or shadow banking, or any other aspects of China's financial system?
You know, Randy, as I said, while I was in China and when I gave some remarks after I returned, I believe China's economic policymakers understand what they need to do in the very difficult economic transition that they're going through. From a principally industrial, export-driven economy to a consumer-driven economy, where the things that happen in the economy and where jobs are going to be created are very different in the future than they were in the past. It's led to excess capacity, which needs to be reduced. It's led to concentrations of people living in places where they're going to end up having to move. This is all very hard. The question is, will they have the political will to do it in a time frame to take advantage of having the tools to deal with it? I believe they have the tools to manage the transition. When you look at China's economy, clearly as one of the two largest economies of the world, it has a lot to do with the global macroeconomic condition. If you look at China's financial interconnection with the world, it is not the same as either American or European or UK financial institutions. The principal spillover is a macroeconomic spillover. It's not through financial channels. That's not to say they don't have a challenge in managing the overhang of credit. And they're going to have to make some tough decisions about what institutions have to be restructured or eliminated and what institutions they work through to protect. They do have some systemic internal issues that they need to distinguish among. That doesn't spill over globally unless it means that the economy of China is going to have a hard landing. So I think the big financial concern, the big global concern, is that China have a soft landing. I don't believe China leveling off to a sustainable level of growth that's in the single digits is a surprise or a bad thing. Everyone knew that the double-digit growth rate couldn't go on forever. The question is how they get from where they were to where they're going. I thought at the beginning of the year there was undue pessimism about China, which was largely driven, I think, by a lack of confidence that they would navigate the path. You look at the tools that China has, they have still an enormous fiscal capacity, they have enormous foreign reserves, they have a political decision-making process where they ought to be able to execute hard choices. That is something that if they can get from here to there, I believe they can manage a soft landing. I think the world will be better off with a stable, growing China because, as I said in my remarks, the United States and China have just been key to global growth in the last decade.
Yeah. Good. I think we have an opportunity to open it up for a couple questions. Do we have questions in the audience here? We'll go two committee members here, one here, one there, and then Ian Talley for the Wall Street Journal. Up front here. Maybe we can ask both of these questions one after the other and let Secretary Lee respond.
Thank you. Hilton at George Mason University. My question concerns China. I'm just wondering what fiscal headroom you believe China has to stimulate this transition to a domestic spending economy, considering that their revenues as a percentage of GDP at 22% is rather low. What tools would they have to, what fiscal tools will they have to put more money in the hands of consumers and at the same time manage to supplement the fiscal revenue side, which is actually weak for an economy of its size?
Whitney Debevoise from Arnold and Porter. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement. I wanted to ask you what opportunities you see for U.S. leadership at the Green Climate Fund. We've pledged $3 billion. We've actually sent $500 million. But I understand that things are a little stagnant in terms of operations. So what do you see we can do to get that going?
Well, thank you. Let me just start on the China piece. Well, the private level of indebtedness in China is quite high. Government indebtedness is actually quite low. And just in its most recent decisions that were announced at the National People's Congress a few weeks ago, China decided to pursue a more expansive fiscal policy by increasing its short-term borrowing. In the long term, they clearly need to have a revenue base that can support sustainable levels of spending. But I think in terms of short-term actions they take to trigger economic growth, particularly growth in a transition where there will need to be a cushion as they go through some pretty disruptive change, I believe they have ample capacity. I actually think the issue is not so much do they have the headroom, but do they use that capacity to drive forward the transition to a more consumer-oriented economy. I think the risk of using that headroom to reinforce investments in old industry and old sectors is actually more of a risk than do they have the headroom to pursue more stimulative fiscal policies. We have very much encouraged China to do things that put money into the hands of consumers as they make moves. And they have a need to do simultaneously structural reforms and fiscal stimulus. It's not either or. They need to change much about the organization of their economy in terms of services versus industrial capacity. They need to allow for market forces to play an increasingly dominant role in the allocation of resources. But they also need to create more consumer spending capacity and cushion some of the transition. We have engaged for some time on these issues. I believe they are moving in that direction. Frankly, I think they could move a little bit more in that direction. With regard to the Green Climate Fund, we've obviously been enormous supporters of it. It was very important to us to get the U.S. contribution in place as quickly as possible. We achieved that with last year's budget agreement, that we had the resources to do so. And now we're at the point of unveiling the institution and moving into the governance space. I can tell you that we are committed to getting it off the ground quickly. We are committed to having it have high standards and to promote both alternative energy and resilience. And I think the fact that we were in a position to make the contribution is key to ongoing U.S. leadership. Sitting here having this conversation at the IMF, I am just deeply aware that when the U.S. Makes a commitment and it takes a long time to keep it, it makes it much harder to maintain maximum pressure to achieve our policy goals. We've done pretty well with some pretty attenuated periods of the world waiting. In the case of the Green Climate Fund, critically important with a new program for us to be on the ground with a financial commitment so that we can help drive the organization of it and have it reflect what we think the right course ahead is. So I'm very pleased we were able to make the contribution, and we're now just going to have to roll up our sleeves with our partners around the world to get it into action.
Hi, Ian Talley, Wall Street Journal. Mr. Secretary, forgive me for hitting Brexit again, but it seems to be continuing to unfold event. Firstly, what are you advising your colleagues or your counterparts in the UK and Europe? It seems that we might not have a new prime minister who's willing to declare Article 50 before October. Chancellor Merkel is saying that this is going to be a slow process. What is your advice there? Secondly, are you aware, Madame Lagarde said that there had been liquidity provided by central banks. Are you aware of any specific liquidity operations, or is this, was this just the swap lines open? And finally, if I can remember the third, nope, it's gone.
Two's enough.
That's good. I'm not sure I would have been able to remember the third. Look, I've been in very close touch with my counterparts, as I mentioned, both finance ministers and central bank governors, not just on Thursday night, but for the weeks preceding, and we remain in touch going forward. I think that we're in a period which will now be defined as a period of change. It's not going to be a day or a week. It's going to be a period of change. I think that the question of the pace at which the formal discussions will take place is something that the United Kingdom and the EU will have to work out on a mutually acceptable basis. And what we all need to do is keep focusing on what can we do as policymakers to continue to promote growth, to promote shared stake in economic growth and economic activity. And we have to do that within our own borders, and we have to do it internationally. We'll be meeting at the G20 in just a few weeks in China. I had a good conversation with the Vice Premier of China yesterday. I think it's not just a question of what do people say the morning after. It's how do we as policymakers show the political will to use the tools we have to continue to drive economic growth during a period of change. And now you only asked two, but I forgot your second question already.
Liquidity.
Oh, on liquidity, it was very important that the United Kingdom prepared in advance, and institutions had a great deal of liquidity. The Bank of England had the ability, if they needed to step in with additional liquidity, and that central banks around the world had worked with the Bank of England to make sure that there would be liquidity if needed in all currencies. We have seen orderly market conditions where liquidity needs have been provided for, and I think that it is not to say that there hasn't been substantial volatility in markets, but it's been volatility in well-functioning markets, which is actually very important when you think not just about the day's wins and losses, but the question of ongoing financial stability. And I think that we can't none of us can predict with certainty how the day will end, the week will end, or the month will end. But I think what we've seen from last Friday through the early market hours today reflects what I'm describing.
A couple other audience questions. Martin Apple, Nancy Jacqueline.
Martin Apple from the Council of Scientific Society Presidents. The world is making rapid change. The United States is changing what constitutes the word work, what the workplace is, what the workforce is, the role of digital instrumentation in the economy and so forth. Are we using the right measures to talk about things like productivity, talking about growth, when in fact, if maybe 40% of our people are, quote, free agents working at home and so forth, and creating economic value and wealth, but not following the models and the policies we've been using for so long?
I think that is a question that economists are thinking real hard about. There's clearly been a lot of change in the economy, not just technology, but as you say, modes of business organization.
Whether or not that's all measured accurately is a question that probably won't be resolved quickly. In the 1990s, we didn't see at the time the full benefit of productivity improvement from technology, even though we knew it had to be there. It didn't show up except with a lag. I think that whatever the measure is, we know that the things we can do as policymakers to promote more innovation, to promote research and development, to promote more training, to build infrastructure, those all contribute to better economic activity in the future, regardless of the form of business organization or the particular technology that's deployed. So I don't think we as policymakers should wait until macroeconomists come up with a new theory of GDP measurement. I think we need to stick to the things that we know, which are that an economy of the future is going to need to have roads and ports that work. It's going to need to have workers trained with the skills for a modern economy. And it's going to need to have a sense of fairness where there isn't a growing sense that the benefits of economic growth just sit with investors at the very top and don't make their way to paychecks. Those are things we're going to need to deal with regardless of where macroeconomists come out over what I think will be a long period of thinking about this.
Nancy Jacqueline.
Nancy Jacqueline, a former U.S. Executive Director at the IMF. You talked about countries needing to use all of their tools to try to promote growth. And I think we all know if the world continues to rely exclusively on monetary policy, the story isn't going to have a happy ending. So now we have another crisis, and we've got headwinds for the U.S. and the global economy. The question is whether this crisis is sufficient to be able to deal with a political paralysis in the major industrialized countries in dealing with fiscal issues and trying to create some kind of fiscal policy complement to monetary policy. Do you see anything in terms of the upcoming meetings to give you and our own economic and political environment to see any hope at all of, in fact, dealing with these headwinds as opposed to letting them kind of blow us all down?
Well, earlier this year, we had a G20 finance ministers meeting in Shanghai, and just a few weeks ago, we had a G7 meeting in Japan. And we discussed these issues at considerable length, and the communique coming out of Shanghai reflected a new consensus. It reflected a commitment to using all policy tools to promote growth. It didn't reflect the kind of debate over austerity versus growth that was characterizing past discussions. The situation in each country will be different. There's different amounts of fiscal space, there's different needs for different kinds of structural reforms, and there's different extents to which monetary tools have been used and where economies are in terms of the appropriateness of changes in monetary policy. So I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all answer to using all the levers. What I do know is that to have the best economic performance, each of us needs to use all the tools that we have, and over-reliance on any one is going to lead to a suboptimal outcome. I think in the aftermath of the G20 commitment to use all tools, you actually saw movement in a number of key economies. China held its National People's Congress just weeks afterwards and committed to using greater fiscal stimulus. Canada has embarked on a new set of fiscal policies and structural policies. China has also embarked on new structural reforms. In Europe, while there hasn't been any formal announcement to relax fiscal tightness, you've seen two things happen. One, a relaxation of some of the targets in countries that are heavily burdened by the refugee crisis, and a willingness in countries with fiscal space to spend additional resources to address the refugee crisis. So Europe has begun to use some of its fiscal space for a very specific reason, but nonetheless with macroeconomic consequences. So, going into Shanghai, there were some people who thought we should have some kind of concerted decision. But this isn't a moment for every economy to move in exactly the same way at the same time. It's a time for each economy to look at what can we do to use our political systems and our economic levers, all of our economic levers, to create both the greatest possibility of domestic growth and contribute to a global economy that badly needs more demand. I mean, the U.S. economy has been supplying a fair amount of the demand in the global economy, and we need to have other economies doing more. I believe that there is increasing focus on using all the tools, but I'm not going to back away from making the case that the time to do that is now. Frankly, it was true before the vote. It's true after the vote. What we can't do is be in a period of uncertainty and create the sense that policymakers are just going to kind of stand back. That's not what I think we should do. It's not what we have been doing. There was deep engagement by policymakers to help prepare for either outcome last week. There's ongoing consultation. We will meet again in a few weeks. I don't think that this period of change will be marked by one moment when everything gets turned around. It's a question of just continuing to move things in the right direction. And if we do that, I believe we can help to create more growth globally.
One more question? Yes, in front here.
Neil Rowland, MLEX Business News. How does Brexit change U.S. regulators' approach to trying to harmonize financial regulations transatlantically, especially since soon you'll face not just one entity with the EU, but two entities? And more immediately, you've lost Jonathan Hill as your point man over there.
We've worked quite hard over the last 3.5 years that I've been at Treasury, but for the number of years before that, to work with the FSB to promote high standards in financial regulatory approaches around the world. We've worked bilaterally with the Bank of England, with European institutions, with institutions in other parts of the world. We will continue to engage with our counterparts. I think that we should all walk away from this last week with a heightened understanding of the benefits of having high standards of capital, high standards of leverage, high standards of resolution. It is, as I've said many times, not going to ever be something that we declare job done, because the financial system isn't going to stay exactly as it is for all time. It will continue to evolve. There is increasing discussion amongst financial authorities about what are the challenges of the future, both in terms of technology and in terms of business organization, and where risk of the future will come from. These conversations have been going on, they are going on, they will continue to go on, and I think we have very robust mechanisms to continue to work internationally to have high standards.
I want to wrap it up with one final question and bring it back to this spirit of multilateralism, because here we are at the fund. Coming up next, we've got David Lipton and Sri Mulyani Indrawati in front of us. The traditional Bretton Woods institutions have mutually reinforcing missions, and you'd like to hope that are regularly cooperating. We all know that there's room for improvement across them, but now we have a new one across the pond too, in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And specifically, what can the U.S. do to help the Bretton Woods institutions promote a harmonious development approach? What specifically can we do from a U.S. leadership standpoint?
Look, I think we're doing quite a lot from a U.S. Leadership standpoint, both in terms of the leadership role we play within these institutions, what we do bilaterally to complement what the institutions do, and even when we are not part of an institution, by providing counsel, guidance, and a public context. And we were talking earlier about the Green Climate Fund. The U.S. has been a leader in driving towards countries coming together, using the existing resources, but supplementing them with new resources, and working as a global community to balance what we do multilaterally and what we do bilaterally to deal with one of the great challenges of our day. With a new institution like the Asia Infrastructure Bank, we were deeply engaged in discussions with potential participants and ultimate participants about how to make sure that that institution, which is geared towards dealing with a very real problem, a shortage of resources and infrastructure around the world, but how to do it in a way that complements the high standards of the IMF and the World Bank. And I think that as a result of our interaction with both the designers in China and the other countries who have joined the institution, the commitments that have come out, both to partner with the old international financial institutions, and to seek to meet standards that are on the same order, that's very important, because getting more resources in at high standards is a good thing. We said that from the beginning. And I think the United States has a unique role in the international financial architecture as one of the principal designers of the system 70 years ago. We also have a key role in recognizing that as the world changes, we need to have inclusive roles for emerging economies, which was one of the reasons that IMF quota reform was so important. It wasn't just about money. It really was important for the IMF to have adequate resources to be able to deal decisively with whatever comes up in the global economy. So yes, it's about the money and the economics. It's also about the investment that countries around the world that are growing have in the international architecture, and sending the message that you need to be part of a system with high values. You're respected and you're at the table. I think that the response that I've gotten around the world to the approval of IMF quota reform has reflected the importance of that. We have, I think, made clear that our actions back up our words in terms of our commitment to ongoing U.S. leadership in these important institutions. And it's one of the reasons I'm so happy to be here today with you and the Bretton Woods Committee, because this is a group that worries about it day in, day out. And I think one of the challenges we have is to make that case so that it's something that people who don't deal with the international financial institutions but look at what does it mean in their day-to-day lives can understand. And translating it into that language is something that all of us, I think, have to take very seriously.
Well, we've been very fortunate to have your investment in the Bretton Woods Committee 2 years in a row now, and especially this year in light of circumstances. We're very pleased that you could join us. So can we have a round of applause for the Secretary? Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Mr.
Randy.
Secretary.